Before we begin this video, I just want to say thank you for all of your wonderful support. And we're so close to becoming monetized, and once that happens, we'll be able to put out a lot more content on a regular basis as opposed to this once in every while kind of thing. So it would greatly help us if you'd make sure that you're subscribed and share some of our videos with your friends. I hear Reddit is a wonderful place to share that kind of stuff. Or Facebook, or Twitter, anywhere really. But without further ado, here's our video. Mind control experiments, tapping into phone lines, and aliens? Okay, the last one's still up for debate, but regardless, there are a lot of things that governments throughout the world have hid from public eyes. Now, just imagine for a second how easy it would be for these types of actions to be covered up by those at the top if, say, the internet didn't exist, phones didn't exist, and well, communication between two cities had to be hand-delivered by a courier. This was the reality for most of human existence. Oftentimes it took weeks for someone to find out important news. If we are to truly think outside of our normal frame of mind for a second, we can begin to imagine all of the crazy things that must have been covered up by, say, royalty in the Middle Ages? Which is why I have decided to bring forth a theory which is inside of one of my favorite books, The Second Messiah by Christopher Knight and Robert Lomas. Before we begin, I'll start with a personal story. Growing up in the late 90s and early 2000s, I became instantly fascinated with all things weird, odd, and occult. I remember that joy and wonder I experienced watching such films as National Treasure and the Da Vinci Code series. It was early fuel for my inquisitive mind to start the spiritual and educational journey, which would eventually become this YouTube channel. But it is writers like Knight and Lomas which have helped continue my path of knowledge, and for that I am extremely grateful. If this is your first time hearing of their literature, I implore you to go check out one of their books at your local library or check the Amazon bookstore. Just a warning though, their books are highly addictive and you won't want to put them down. First, a little context. King Solomon, son of David, built the first temple of Jerusalem sometime between the 10th and 6th centuries BCE. It was to be a holy place, where the covenant of Moses was to be housed. It consisted of three separate parts, the outer layer, the inner layer, and the Sanctum Sanctorum, or Holy of Holies, the latter of which would be the sacred room dedicated to the covenant itself. It was built by thousands of craftsmen under the guidance of a master builder. Only a select few were able to step inside the Sanctum Sanctorum: King Solomon himself, the master builder, and the high priests of the temple. The high priests, known as Zadokites, were men whose lineage comes from Zadok. Zadok was the high priest of the temple during the reigns of David and Solomon. He was the descendant of Aaron, the brother of Moses and the first of the successors to guard the physical covenant of God to humanity. It was truly a family business. The lineage of these priests continued in the temple, and then after its destruction and rebuilding into the Second Temple, until the year 60 AD, when it was destroyed by Roman legions during the conquest of Jerusalem. And, well, that's where the story ends for the Zadokites, at least according to the accepted theory. But Christopher Knight and Robert Lomas have another theory that could prove that the Zadokites, still to this day, are far from extinct. The second apocryphal book of Esdras, also known as the fourth book of Ezra, which is widely used in Latin Christian texts and some Catholic Bibles, was written just days before the fall of the temple. It tells of a vision from the high priests who knew the future fate of the temple. It is written, "And they were all mixed together, the blast of fire, the flaming breath, and this great tempest, and fell with violence upon the multitude which was prepared to fight, and burned them up, everyone, so that upon a sudden of an innumerable multitude nothing was perceived, but only dust and the smell of smoke. When I saw, I was afraid." The priests, knowing of an upcoming assault, withdrew their most precious scrolls and treasures, and fled to ensure that millennia worth of history and knowledge would not be destroyed. After the assault was completed, Roman and Jewish historian Josephus wrote of secret tunnels underneath the temple where Jewish fighters hid after the Romans started to overwhelm their forces. This Simon Bar Giora during the siege of Jerusalem, had occupied the upper town, but when the Roman army entered within the walls and were sacking the whole city, he, accompanied by his most faithful friends, along with some stonecutters, bringing the tools required for their craft, and provisions sufficient for many days, let himself down with all his party into one of the secret passages. So far as the old excavation intended, they followed it, but when solid earth met them, they began mining, hoping to be able to proceed further, emerge in safety, and so escape. But experience of the task provided this hope delusive, for the miners advanced slowly with difficulty, and the provisions through their husbanded were nearly exhausted. Thereupon Simon, imagining that he could cheat the Romans by creating a scare, dressed himself in white tunics and buckling over them a purple mantle arose out of the ground at the very spot whereon the temple formerly stood. The spectators were first aghast and remained motionless, but afterwards they approached nearer and inquired who he was. This Simon declined to tell them, but bade them summon a general. Accordingly, they promptly ran to fetch him, and Terentius Rufus, who had been left in command of the force, appeared. He, after hearing from Simon the whole truth, kept him in chains and informed Caesar of the manner of his capture. His emergence from the ground led, moreover, to the discovery, during those days, a large number of other rebels in subterranean passages. On the return of Caesar to Caesarea on Sea, Simon was brought to him in chains, and he ordered the prisoner to be kept for the triumph, which he was preparing to celebrate in Rome. Something that should be noted about this quote is the existence of white robes, which according to the uniforms of various Jewish sects was reserved only for the Essenes. The Essenes being the order of monastic priests, who were also said to be Zadokites. The Essenes had 3 degrees within their ranks, similar to modern-day Freemasons. Keep that in mind for later in the video. Basically, the high priests hid valuable items of both physical and spiritual importance under the temple in hopes of returning one day to retrieve them when the rage of the Roman Empire quieted down. Throughout the conquests of Roman legions between 66 and 70 AD, an approximate 1.3 million men, women, and children were slaughtered. It wasn't until 325 AD where the Roman Empire would accept Christianity as its main religion, and so there were a few centuries where Judeo-Christian history would be suppressed and ultimately doctored. Nearly 1,000 years later, the Seljuk Turks would arrive in Jerusalem and take over the Temple Mount in the name of Islam. So what happened to the alleged treasures within the subterranean labyrinth? Pause. Let's fast forward a little bit. In 1095 AD, Pope Urban II proposed in front of his council that a band of knights should be assembled to protect Christian pilgrims in their travels to the Holy Land, as it was not uncommon to hear of people being injured or robbed by bandit groups and Muslim militants. By the fall of the next year, individual groups began to meet in Constantinople under the guidance of their noble leaders. Each leader was responsible for the welfare and finances of their group initially. The following May, they attacked the Turkish capital of Nicaea, the place where Christianity had been originally formalized, and were able to seize control of it. This began a series of rapid success stories for the group, and they quickly grew in numbers and assets. In 1104, Hugh de Champagne, a middle-ranking nobleman, and his family traveled to Jerusalem for reasons unknown. In 1114, he returned to Jerusalem again for, well, reasons unknown. 4 years after that, in 1118, King Baldwin I died, and his successor, Baldwin II, took control. It was then when Hugh de Champagne would assemble his team of 9 knights and made his approach towards Jerusalem. Pope Urban II would die around the same time that Jerusalem was taken by the Crusaders, and the warrior chief Godfrey de Bouillon, leader of the initial groups who banded together under the papacy, would also die during the siege. It would seem that either by fate or by plan, someone was setting the course for new leadership within the Crusaders. The 9 initial knights were Hugh de Payenne, Champagne's vassal lord, Godfrey de Saint-Omer, André de Montbard, Payenne de Montdidier, Acambau de Saint-Amand, Gondomir, Rosal, Godfrey, and Geoffrey Bissol. They swore an oath of chastity, obedience, and to hold all property collectively as a group. They were initially called the Poor Knights of the Temple of King Solomon, later known as the Knights Templar. Another important figure of the Templar story was a holy man by the name of Bernard de Clairvaux. Yes, the source of inspiration behind the Saint Bernard dog breed. Clairvaux's involvement with both the Papal State and the Templars is certainly a curious situation indeed. In summary, Clairvaux was a Cistercian monk. The Cistercian order was founded by a group of Benedictine friars from the Abbey of Molesme, just months before the taking of Jerusalem and the death of Pope Urban II. The Cistercian order was based on the principle of receding back into the more traditional teachings of Saint Benedict, the father of Western monasticism. The Benedictine order had 3 main tenets: communal living, physical labor, and minimal conversation between members. Knight and Lomas referred to the Benedictine way of life being similar to the Essenes, who also lived communally, faced 3 years of physical labor, and were forbade to speak during the first year as an initiate. It is also too coincidental to leave out that the Cistercians were called white monks due to their color of robes, white being the color reserved in New Testament times to the clothing of the Essenes. Clairvaux was born into a noble family in Dijon.
I said mustard, Jerry. Dijon.
In 1090 AD, and became a Cistercian priest at the age of 23. His choice was met with opposition from his family, as the Cistercian order was, as said before, based in communal living and not on luxury. The hilarious part of this story is that Bernard's older brother, the Count of Fontaine, and 30 other members of their family actually ended up joining the Cistercian order themselves, despite early criticism. Apparently Clairvaux proved that there was something to gain from it. In fact, Saint Bernard was no stranger to impressing those around him. Within 2 years of his ordaining, he not only got a large chunk of his family to become priests, but also became the abbot of a new order based in Clairvaux, bought and paid for by Hugh de Champagne. Back in those days, it took at least a few years to establish and build a proper monastery, so it is perfectly okay to assume that Hugh de Champagne had commissioned the building around the same time that Bernard had become ordained. It was almost as if it was planned. Oh, and if the coincidences weren't crazy enough, Bernard de Clairvaux was actually the nephew of founding Templar member André de Montbard. This is the part of the book where Knight and Lomas made a puzzle piece discovery. When they were working on their research for their book, The Hiram Key, they met with a historian and writer by the name of Dr. Tim Wallace Murphy. He informed them in conversation about the history of the Templars and Bernard de Clairvaux that he had met an elderly man in France who was a direct descendant of Hugh de Payenne. When the man had reached the age of 21, his father pulled him aside and informed him that he was about to share secret knowledge that has been passed down through their family for centuries. He was to pass this information on to his son when he was the same age to keep the family tradition. Before I read this response, remember that this is solely based on words of a friend of Robert Lomas and Christopher Knight. So just take it with a grain of salt because it's not written down or anything. It's just an interesting statement and worth noting. This is what the man had to say. At the time, even before Jesus was born, the priests of the Temple of Jerusalem ran 2 schools, one for boys and one for girls. The priests were known by titles which were the names of angels, such as Michael, Mazaldek, and Gabriel. This was the way in which they preserved the pure lines of Levi and David. When each of the chosen girls had passed through puberty, one of the priests would impregnate her with the seed of the holy bloodline, and once pregnant, she would be married off to a respectable man to bring up the child. It was the custom when these children reached the age of 7 years that they were handed back to the temple schools to be educated by the priests. Thus, stated the Frenchman, was a virgin called Mary, visited by the priest known as the angel Gabriel, who had her with child. She was then married off to Joseph, who was a far older man. According to this verbal tradition, Mary found it difficult to enjoy life with Joseph, her first husband, because he was too old for her. But over time, she grew to love him and had another 4 boys and 3 girls. After Jesus was crucified by the main pillars of the Jerusalem church were James the Just, supported by Peter and John, the beloved disciple. They formed a triumvirate, which was the traditional Essene way of ruling. After telling Dr. Wallace Murphy this recollection, he goes further by saying that after Jesus was crucified, James the Just, Peter, and John became the 3 figureheads of the movement, in a way similar to the 3 principal officers of a Masonic lodge. After James was killed, but before the destruction of the temple, the Nazarene priests allegedly went to Greece and then scattered all across Europe. They returned to Jerusalem after the temple was leveled to obtain the remains of the one they called the Savior. In 600 AD, the descendants of the priests would bury the remains under the temple, even though it was forbidden to bury anyone under the temple. They knew it was the safest place to keep such a valuable treasure. The group of surviving high priests would band together to create a hidden society known as Rex Deus, or Kings of God. They assimilated into various societies throughout Europe and blended into the religions and cultures of their respective lands. In time, the families of the past priests of Jerusalem, at least according to these accounts, would form some of Europe's most elite and noble families. It was these statements by the old Frenchman, who claimed to be a member of the Rex Deus himself, that were the missing link in the story of the Templars and their connection to the Temple of Jerusalem. Jesus is dead and risen. The hierarchy of the Christian movement is executed. Jerusalem falls to the pagan Roman Empire, and thousands of years of religious history are soon to be lost. The priests hide their valuable treasures under the temple in a series of underground tunnels, and, knowing that they cannot come back for them out of fear of being killed, pass on the information through family lineage until the time was right. Hugh de Champagne, a nobleman of the French kingdoms and supposed member of Rex Deus, hearing of his family duty, makes 2 trips to Jerusalem and returned home with enough wealth to finance a new order of knights and build a monastery which was overseen by another Rex Deus member. This would result in the world's most powerful army of warriors at the time, as well as the first recorded banking system. Kings and popes would pay large sums of money for their service. The common people were protected by these knights on previously dangerous roads. The Knights Templar were the rulers of the Western world. These are the connections Lomas and Knight make in their research. But why is this important? The families of Jewish priests became mostly Christianized by 1100 AD, with knowledge of ancient and secret wisdom passed through the ages. They were in possession of the most valuable treasure, which they guarded with their lives, the very lineage of David and Aaron, the bloodline of Christ, and the key to unlocking the truth behind Christianity itself. To end this video, I will note that another group emerged around the time of the Templars in 1099 AD called the Priory of Sion. Now, if you've seen the movie The Da Vinci Code, the Priory is the group of people that are protecting the bloodline in that movie, but more specifically the Merovingian bloodline. And if Lomas and Knight's theory is correct about the Rex Deus, then the Merovingians were most definitely a part of that lineage, that bloodline. I hope you enjoyed this video, and remember that this is all theory, but as I always say, theory is the root of discovery. Make sure to like and subscribe and comment down below if you have any ideas for other videos. Thank you.